So I have the privilege and pleasure to talk with Jonas Schultz, who's professor emeritus at UC Irvine in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. Uh, Professor Schultz has been a long-time member of UCI, one of the founding faculty members back in 1966, and also one of the founding members signing the charter for UCI's Phi Beta Kappa chapter. So it's great to talk with you, Jonas.
Yeah, same here.
So maybe we could start, if you could just tell us about how you were inducted into Phi Beta Kappa, where you were, and what was going on at the time.
I was an undergraduate at Columbia College in New York, and I was inducted in my junior year in 1955,
Wow.
which was a great honor, and I consider it today still to be a great honor. One of the things that I'm proud of.
Uh-huh. And did you know of Phi Beta Kappa before you were inducted, or was this
Oh
kind of out
yes,
of the blue?
yes, it was considered something very important on campus,
Mm.
and being inducted in junior year was special for me too.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
especially selective that year. Uh-huh.
yeah.
Okay. And so then you graduated a year later, and what happened? Where did you go with your career after Columbia?
Well, I stayed on at Columbia for quite a while.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I was a physics major. Actually, I had entered college as a chemical engineering major, and
Ah,
primarily because of the job situation. I knew you could get jobs. It was a very popular profession at that time.
mm-hmm.
But then during my first couple of years, for the first year and a half, I discovered really that everything I liked about chemistry was really physics. And I was really attracted to physics. I mean, that started even in high school. I went to a superb high school in New York, Stuyvesant High School.
Uh-huh.
One other of my physics colleagues, Hank Sobel, was at Stuyvesant High School. Not we weren't there at the same time. I was there earlier, and the two of us reminisce sometimes about what a great school that was.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a wonderful physics teacher there, a tall, gaunt man who always wore a white coat to lecture, and spoke very softly, but very, very precisely, and that impressed me. Physics was a precise subject, and he stressed the mathematics, and I loved math.
Uh-huh.
And so I became a physics major eventually after I decided that chemical engineering was not for me, even though I didn't know what kind of jobs a physicist could get. We all knew about the work they had done at Los Alamos during the war. We knew a little less about radar, which was the other important contribution.
Uh-huh.
But this was before Sputnik went up. And before
Okay.
Sputnik went up, physics was not a very big major. It was, I think maybe I had a half a dozen other physics majors in my class at Columbia.
Hmm.
But I decided on physics as a major, even though I had been attracted during college to other things. Philosophy of science was one, and journalism was another.
Hmm.
So those were two other possibilities for me. In fact, I had been a journalist all through school. I worked on student newspaper. And in
Mhm.
my senior year, despite the fact that I was a physics major by that time, I was editor-in-chief of the campus daily newspaper. So I took on that job, and I loved it. I loved the excitement of journalism.
Mhm.
But ultimately, I decided physics was for me. I went to see the chair of the department for advice on graduate school. And he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I think I want to do elementary particle theory." And he said, "Well, we have T.D. Lee here. He's the greatest in the world. Why would you want to go anywhere else?" And he convinced me. So I applied to Columbia, and even though it wasn't recommended to stay on the same place to go to graduate school as your undergraduate school,
Uh-huh.
but I decided to go to Columbia if that was the best place. And it was. Those days, it was certainly the best place in the world to do physics.
Absolutely, yes.
And I applied and I got admitted. And sure enough, 2 years later, when it was time to find a thesis advisor, I approached Professor Lee and asked him if I could work for him. And he did the usual thing. He gave me a practice problem, which I worked on and came back a few weeks later. And he took me on as a student. And everything was fine. I started working and searching for a problem to work on. And then there was a wrinkle in the road because a couple of years later, he left Columbia to go to the Institute for Advanced Study. By this time, he had won a Nobel Prize, actually by about 3 months before I approached him. and I had to work up the courage actually at that point to go see him.
Yeah.
He had won a Nobel Prize, but he left while I was a couple of years into my thesis work to go to the institute, and it was just a complication. I could go and visit him at the institute. That wasn't too bad, but it certainly was a distance between us. And so, but I completed my thesis, and I then started looking for a postdoctoral job. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to stay in New York if I could. My wife, I was married at that time. My wife had a good job as a technical writer for a chemical company in New York, and I thought it would be great if she could continue. So I looked for a job in the vicinity of New York. Was having some problem finding one, and then one of the young assistant professors at Columbia approached me and said, "Why do you want to?" He was an experimental particle physicist. He said, "Why do you want to be a theorist? The chances of you doing something useful are much better in experimental physics than theoretical physics." How about that, Jonathan? And he offered me a job. He offered me a postdoctoral position to work with him. We proposed an experiment together, a bubble chamber experiment at Brookhaven. Uh-huh. And just when that was about to come off, another experiment he was working on took top priority. He had been working on it for a few years. This experiment was Mel Schultz, and he had this experiment at Brookhaven to use a neutrino beam to investigate weak interactions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so Mel went off, but they already had a good, complete group working on the experiment. He went off, and I wound up working in Jack Steinberger's bubble chamber group. Now, Jack and Mel were working together on this neutrino experiment with Leon Lederman. Uh-huh. And of course, the three of them won a Nobel Prize for it, so I can't begrudge them.
Yeah, I was going to say, every name you mentioned has won a Nobel Prize. You're just surrounded by these.
Well, that actually has been a recurrent theme in my career, working together with people or under people who won Nobel Prizes. It's not hereditary, though. So, in any case, I worked in Jack Steinberger's group, which was a wonderful experience. Jack was just an outstanding physicist. Unfortunately, as you know, he died last week, and at the age of 99. So he had a full lifetime, a full career. Mm-hmm. But he was just an incredible human being, a wonderful person, nice person, dynamic physicist, and I learned a lot. Certainly, I learned a lot from him. Mm-hmm. And I learned how to do bubble chamber physics. That was one of the things. So I had a real change in my career, real change in directions in my career. After 2 years working at the Nevis Cyclotron Laboratory under Jack, it was time to leave the nest finally, to leave Columbia. I had been there 11 years, 4 as an undergraduate, 5 as a graduate student, and 2 as a postdoc. Mm-hmm. And there was an opening at Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley for someone to help a young professor who was a former Columbia student and postdoc, who was there now as a professor at Berkeley, who was starting a bubble chamber group. It was a small group within a larger group. This is a Gray Chamberlain group. Now, of course, these were 2 other people who had previously won Nobel Prizes about 3 years before. Uh-huh. So this was a chance to get into a wonderful group. It's funny, I was also offered an assistant professorship at a university, a good university in New Jersey. So I could have stayed in the New York area, but it was with someone who had been at Columbia previously, so it wouldn't have been like leaving the nest. It would have been like a continuation. Uh-huh, uh-huh. And I thought, really, it is time to go, time to leave. And the lure of California was great.
I see.
So I left. We packed our 1-year-old baby in the car. Wow. And drove cross country. I'll never forget it. It was an incredible experience going across the country and seeing this enormous country of ours, beautiful country. Uh-huh. And wound up at Berkeley at the Rad Lab, and I loved it there. It was a wonderful group, wonderful experience. And after a couple of years at Berkeley, UCI opened up. And Ken Ford, who was the founding chair of the physics department, who was doing the recruiting, came by and asked me if I was willing to come to Irvine to start a group of my own. Now, I was completing 2 postdocs. It was about time to move on to a faculty position, if possible. Mm-hmm. And but I looked around, and Berkeley was such a great place to be. It was not just the physics department, which was now, I think, the best in the world, but the ferment on campus. And it was an exciting time. This was the time of the free speech movement, the time of
so early 60s, mid 60s.
The early 60s. There were a lot of, and Berkeley was a really strong intellectual community. And of course, they all told me, you can't go down to Southern California. There's no culture down there. But after the first year, I turned down Ken the first year, but then he came back and the position hadn't been filled. And he asked me if I would come again. And I came the second year the campus was open. With this great opportunity. I thought, how could you turn down an opportunity to start something of your own and build your own group in a fresh place? And certainly there was everything, all kinds of opportunity. A new place like Irvine offered all kinds of opportunity. So I left. We moved down to Southern California and found it was much better than some of the people in Northern California thought. And I started a group, started to recruit people. And it turned out that the bubble chamber group I had been in at Berkeley was a very pleasant group with a number of very good students in it. And eventually 2 of them were attracted to UCI. 2 others were attracted to UCI as faculty members, Mark Mandelkern and Riley Newman. From that group who had impressed me very much. I recommended them, and they came down to Irvine to work. And Mark eventually spent his whole career working with me here. His whole career as a physicist. Of course, he has another career as a doctor, but he spent the year and his years here working with me, and eventually became my co-principal investigator, my co-leader of the group. And so Berkeley contributed more than just me to the UCI campus. It contributed quite a few others.
And also when you got here to UCI, I mean, I've seen photos of those early years. It looks really, small and not that many buildings.
But it was wonderful. The first time I came, there were, I think, only 4 buildings on the campus, and there was a lot of mud, a lot of construction going on. But that all showed promise. It all showed that something new was happening here.
So did you even at that point sort of think that it would end up like it is now? Or
well, it was a gamble. We all knew it was a gamble, but we had all come from good places. We knew things. And everyone was participating. Everyone was taking on new responsibilities, and we thought it would work out, and it has worked out spectacularly. I mean, I do not regret for a minute having left Berkeley to come here. In those early days, we were all asked to do things that were brand new to us. I think during my first year as a faculty member, it's my first faculty job, I was put on a small committee to work with the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs to put together a 5 or 10 year academic plan for the campus. Now, of course, I didn't know anything about how you put together an academic plan for a campus. But we all took it seriously. We worked on it. It turned out nothing came of that committee because the Vice Chancellor picked up and left to become a chancellor or a rector at another university, a university in Australia. So, and the new Vice Chancellor came in and he had his own ideas and his own people that he wanted to work with. But we were all trying to do things to build a campus, to build something new. The academic senate was tiny. I mean, the whole campus, all the faculty, was a relatively small number. We could all fit into a small theater, the little theater in humanities, for academic senate meetings. And everyone was a member of the Senate. Everyone participated in all the meetings. We'd go to the meetings and everyone would talk. You got to meet other faculty members from other disciplines, which was wonderful. Nowadays, it's very difficult to meet faculty members from other disciplines. The campus is somewhat bigger and a lot bigger and somewhat fragmented in that way.
Right.
If you participate in the academic senate, as I know you do very actively, you get to meet other faculty members. That's one of the joys of participating.
Absolutely. Right.
And we were, as let's say, all game for doing new things. And it turned out that 5 years after I came to UCI, I received a call from someone I knew at the National Science Foundation, the division director of the physics division director at National Science Foundation. asking me if I would come in for a year to run the elementary particle physics program for NSF, to be the program director. The current program director had retired. He had been the one since the start of NSF, and he retired or had to leave for illness. I forget exactly what the situation was. And I was asked if I would just rotate in for a year and run the program while they searched for a permanent director. Mm-hmm. I thought about it for a while and said, gee, this is an interesting opportunity. Washington is a very attractive place to go to. I could learn a lot about federal government, about science in general. I was about to go on vacation. It was during the summer that I was called. I was asked to come in the fall. My wife and I went on vacation with our family and talked about it and said, our house is a little small now. Our family had just increased. We had 3 children. We needed a bigger house. We said, let's sell our house, move to Washington for a year, come back, buy a new house. And we did that. We decided very quickly, we put a house on the market. 2 weeks later, it had sold.
Wow, okay.
And we moved to Washington for the year. National Science Foundation was very good about it. They wouldn't put my family furniture in storage for me, but they moved it out from Irvine to Washington, and at the end of the year, they moved it back. It seemed to me a silly way to do things, but the federal government does things in strange ways. And I spent a terrific year in Washington as the program director, as the acting program director. I learned an enormous amount because everyone who wanted some money, who had an idea, would come to Washington and tell you about it. And so I learned all kinds of things. Including, I was asked to run the gravity program because the person who ran the gravity program had a conflict. He was from the University of Maryland. He had a part-time position at the University of Maryland, and the gravity program at that time consisted of Joe Weber, basically. And he couldn't, who was at Maryland, and the program director, the program director of gravity couldn't handle his grant. So I was asked to handle his grant, and I said, well, I don't know anything about gravity. So I took out a copy of Joe Weber's book, General Relativity and Gravitational Waves, from the library, and I started learning general relativity. I mean, I had previously learned some, but I certainly couldn't be considered, well-versed in it. I learned gravity, and I dealt with Joe, and we developed a friendship after that. And eventually that turned into a friendship with Virginia. Virginia wife who married him. And so I learned a new field, basically, which has always been an interest of mine since then.
So were you there before or after you were dean of the graduate division here?
No, I came back from Washington. After a year, I came back from Washington. And no sooner did I come back and move into a new house, and I remember sitting in my new house, which was a shambles, because we bought a fixer-upper, and we were working on it. And one day on a weekend, I had a visit at home, sort of a surprise visit from Hazard Adams, who was Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs. And he said to me, you've been in Washington doing science administration. How would you like to be dean of the graduate division in charge of science for the campus? Because at that point, we didn't have a vice chancellor for science, for research. That was a role of the dean of the graduate division.
Oh, okay.
And well, I had just come back and I just tried something new. I said, sure, I'll try something new again. Let's see how this works out. And I took over as dean that fall. It was 1972. And I stayed on for several years as dean. And it was, again, a wonderful experience learning about the campus and getting to meet everyone on campus, getting to know everyone on campus, which was a wonderful experience. But then after 4 years, I began to realize that if I stayed on any longer, it would mean giving up my research career. It would be giving up teaching, basically, and becoming an administrator. And I was still a young guy. I didn't want to do that. So I stepped down, I resigned, went back to physics as a full-time chair. I'd continued teaching while I was dean of the graduate division, but on a part-time basis. And now I went back full-time teaching and research and tried to resuscitate my group, which in the interim had, lagged a little bit.
Uh-huh.
It's hard to do both, to do little, full-time administration and also part-time research and part-time teaching.
Right, right.
But I don't regret having been dean of the graduate division. Again, it was a good experience, and I did administrative work later as chair of the physics department, which was again a good contribution, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I really do not regret having gone back to teaching and research rather than full-time high-level university administration.
Yeah, okay. So maybe we can talk about some of the research you did go back to do. I mean, you
Yeah,
came out
well,
with some pretty remarkable discoveries.
we had some interesting things going on. Since I had been doing bubble chamber physics, when I came here, what I did was I started a bubble chamber group. In the mid-'60s, this was a very productive way of doing physics, of doing experimental physics. In the 50s and 60s and for part of the 70s, the bubble chamber technique discovered all kinds of new particles and studied the properties of particles. It was the best way to do it. We had done a lot of work on antiproton interactions and bubble chamber. And after a while, we moved off into when the bubble chamber technique was no longer as productive as it had been, when we started looking for rarer processes and high data, high statistics experiments. The more of the electronic techniques took over, electronic detectors. And so we switched and started, and Mark, my colleague Mark, was one of the people who was most productive in moving us in that direction. We were doing experiments at Brookhaven, looking for bound states of protons and antiprotons that had been predicted by theory.
Mm-hmm.
And we continued on in that vein. During the late 70s, when UCI got involved in the IMB proton decay experiment, you remember the time when unified field theories came along and predicted that protons would decay. It was an important thing to search for proton decay. And I joined in with Fred Reines's group at that point. I took some of my guys and we joined in with Fred to work on the IMB experiment, Irvine, Michigan, and Brookhaven. And of course, that experiment led to it showed that the proton decay didn't occur basically at a level predicted by theories, and that the lifetime was much longer than theories predicted, much longer than the lifetime of the universe. And so that was important, but it also wound up as serendipitously as an incredible experiment because, as you recall, that experiment detected a burst of neutrinos from a supernova nearby.
Right.
Neutrinos that had started out about 170,000 years ago. And we just happened to be in a good place at a good time. And the experiment saw that in coincidence with an experiment in Japan, at the Kamiokanda experiment, the two of them, and the two experiments together couldn't be a fluke. It had to be a real event,
right.
Which showed that whatever people thought about the theory of supernovas was actually correct. The right amount of energy was given off by a supernova, and the neutrinos carried off most of that energy. It was a fantastic result. Serendipitously, we just happened to be there.
Yeah.
I had another serendipitous experiment that we were doing together with three Italian groups. We were doing an experiment at Fermilab. Three Italian groups and a couple of and Northwestern University and collaborators from Fermilab. We were doing an experiment of antiprotons colliding with protons, making charmonium states, bound states of charm, anti-charm quarks, and studying the properties of those quarks, those bound states. And along came a couple of theorists who said, while you're doing that experiment, you're making anti-hydrogen atoms, making antimatter in the sense of a full anti-element.
Yeah, antiproton. Anti-atom.
Anti-hydrogen consisting of an antiproton and a positron. And you could understand the process, how it occurs, and it had been calculated to show that we were producing a certain number of anti-hydrogen atoms in our collisions. So if our group, not the other groups, but our group, and together with a Fermilab collaborator, put up and built an experiment to detect those anti-atoms. And we did that, and we showed that, in fact, they do exist, and they were created. Another group at CERN was doing the same experiment, and they did it. I think we did a better job. But in any case, it was very exciting to discover something that you didn't expect in an experiment that was set up for an entirely different reason.
Yeah, no,
it shows the way science goes.
Absolutely. I knew, the supernova, of course, I knew that was sort of serendipitous, but I didn't realize the anti-atom work was also. I thought you had, in the current way things are done, you set out, 10 years in advance and propose things, and they get rejected, and then finally they go through and you build it. Sounds like this was a much different experience and different time.
Yeah, well, we had this, to begin with, we had a target. There was the circulating beam of antiprotons in a storage ring, and we had a target that could produce antiproton collisions. Mm-hmm. And what it mattered was to build a few extra little detectors, some magnets and some detectors to detect the anti-atom, to detect the antiproton, and show that when it splits up, it does indeed split up. It's a neutral atom which splits up into an antiproton and a positron. And it wasn't trivial, but we had colleagues who built it, and experiment was done, and it worked out. And we had a wonderful graduate student who worked on it and got his degree on that, based on that experiment. Mm-hmm. So he had a great experience.
Yeah.
Science is a wonderful thing, and physics is the best of the sciences, without doubt. You know that, and
you won't get an argument from this interviewer for that.
and the important thing is that theory and experiment. I started off as a graduate student in theory, and became an experimentalist, and spent the rest of my life as an experimentalist. But always with an interest in theory, always wanting to learn more and more of the theory. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that came about was because I was at Columbia, where at that time, where theorists and experimentalists worked together very, very closely. In fact, there were prominent members of the Columbia faculty who did both. In those days, it was still possible to do both. I.I. Rabi, who was sort of the leading member of the physics department in those days, did both theory and experiment in atomic and molecular physics.
Right.
And you may remember Willis Lamb, who was a theoretical student of Oppenheimer, and did probably the most important experiment of the 20th century, the measurement of the Lamb shift. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then there was James Rainwater at Columbia, who was one of our teachers, one of our nuclear physics teachers, who was a nuclear experimentalist and won a Nobel Prize for a theory of nuclear structure, based on a paper in Physical Review, which is about 3 pages long. but he did a wonderful calculations of nuclear structure theory. Uh-huh. So theorists and experimentalists, interchangeable, and all of us are descended from Fermi. That's for sure. Yeah. You look at any particle physicist today, and it's just a few steps away from Fermi, a few degrees from Enrico Fermi. Uh-huh. We were taught by his students, and or his students, or the students. Right. We all go back, and Fermi, of course, was a great theorist and experimentalist at the same time.
Yeah. I guess T.D. Lee was his student, so that's you trace.
That's right. T.D. Lee was a student of Fermi. Yeah. Jack Steinberger was a student of Fermi. Mel Schwartz was a student of Jack Steinberger. All of these, there is a connection everywhere.
Yeah.
And I notice you're becoming an experimentalist too now. So
so
welcome to the club.
It's a grand tradition for sure.
Yes, it's a grand tradition, and the best of luck in that experiment. It's going to be a great experiment, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, thank you. So speaking of the grand traditions, then maybe we could circle back to UCI and Phi Beta Kappa. I'm just kind of curious if you recall anything about the founding of Phi Beta Kappa, which was...
I remember being asked, should we have a chapter of Phi Beta Kappa? And I said enthusiastically, yes. I think it's a wonderful way to honor students. I think it's something that students, when they're aware of the honor, should shoot for it, to try to aim to get there. And it's an encouragement to do well in your studies. Mm-hmm. But I think, I think it's not just an honor. It's not just a pat on the back. It's also an acknowledgement that the student is a very capable, competent scholar who could go on and should go on to higher things, to aim higher, and to eventually become a leader. I mean, it's sort of an acknowledgement that you're ready to lead. You're ready to go on to better and more important challenges. And I hope it serves as that kind of purpose for students if they recognize that it is that kind of acknowledgement.
Right.
I would strongly hope that we could get a chapter that captures the imagination of the students and captures their interest, and it becomes something that students aim for and accept, not just, as I say, as an honor, but as an acknowledgement of their ability and a verification, a confirmation of their ability to go further and higher.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you. It's very encouraging to hear you say that, having heard your history and the history, which is pretty much entwined with the history of physics in the last 50, 60 years.
Oh, so yeah.
It's just fascinating to hear.
The privilege I've had to work with and know the people I've experienced with, it's just fantastic. I love it,
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jonas. It's wonderful to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure. Good luck with the advancement of Phi Beta Kappa, the Mu chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. I'm very happy that you've taken that role. You're willing to take on all kinds of challenges on the campus, and the campus really benefits from it. That's great.
Yeah, thank you.